Emily had always wanted a cat. Not a dog, which she found too demanding, but something smaller, more independent, a companion she could love and care for, without feeling like she was being overwhelmed. So, when she found the tiny black kitten on a cold autumn afternoon, her heart melted. He had been abandoned, just a few days old, weak and trembling. She couldn't leave him there alone, not in the damp, chilly weather. She wrapped him up in her jacket, took him to the vet, and slowly nursed him back to health. She named him Shadow because of the deep, inky color of his fur, which reminded her of the soft darkness of night. In the beginning, he was nothing more than a little ball of warmth and playfulness. Shadow had a way of curling up on her lap, purring contentedly as if the world had always been safe for him. His little paws would knead her blanket, and his eyes, wide and innocent, gazed at her with love and trust. Emily was sure she had raised an ordinary kitten, one who would grow up to be the kind of cat who lounged in sunbeams, who played with string, and who let out an occasional, contented meow. But as time passed, something in Shadow changed. It wasn't immediate, not noticeable at first. He simply grew like any cat does, stronger, faster, and more agile. But there was a shift, something subtle that Emily couldn't place. Shadow no longer seemed to want to be held, no longer sought her lap for the familiar comfort. Instead, he began to prefer the shadows, the dark corners of the house, where his sleek form blended into the dimness, his glowing eyes the only indication of his presence. Emily thought it was just a phase, that perhaps he was simply becoming more independent as he got older. Cats, after all, were known for their aloofness. Still, she couldn't ignore the little things that began to unsettle her. His gaze, once warm and inviting, had grown cold. He would often stare at her from across the room, his eyes narrowing when she approached, as if calculating his next move. It wasn't the loving gaze of a pet, it was more predatory, as though he were assessing her, weighing her worth. Emily shook her head, trying to brush away the feeling. After all, Shadow was still a kitten. In many ways, he just had his quirks. Months passed, and Emily couldn't shake the growing unease she felt every time Shadow was around. It wasn't just the stares or the distance. It was the way he seemed to slip in and out of rooms, the soft padding of his paws barely audible on the hardwood floors, the way he would disappear for hours, only to reappear at the foot of her bed, watching her silently in the dark. Sometimes Emily would wake in the middle of the night to find him perched at the end of the bed, his eyes gleaming, his body rigid. She would dismiss it as him being a cat, needing attention or affection, but the longer she lived with him, the more she felt the distance between them. One evening, Emily was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when Shadow wandered into the room. He was unusually quiet, more so than usual. His tail flicked in the air, brushing against the side of the couch in an almost nervous rhythm. Emily looked up, and for a moment, their eyes locked. She felt a chill run down her spine, but she quickly dismissed it. Cats stared at people all the time, didn't they? But then Shadow did something that made her blood run cold. He moved closer, just a few inches from her feet, and instead of curling up as he usually did, he simply sat there, staring. His posture was tense, his back slightly arched, as though he were preparing for something, waiting for something. Emily's heart beat faster as she slowly set her book aside. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong. This wasn't normal behavior, even for a cat. Shadow's presence was no longer comforting, it was unsettling. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she reached a hand out toward him. "What's wrong, little guy?" But the kitten did not respond. He didn't purr, didn't nudge her hand like he used to. He simply stared, his pupils dilated, his gaze piercing. It was as if he could see through her, into the deepest corners of her soul. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. Eventually, Shadow turned away and padded off toward the hallway, his steps measured and deliberate. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. But the feeling of dread lingered in the pit of her stomach. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel Shadow's gaze on her, watching, waiting. It wasn't just the unsettling silence, but the way he moved in the house, always slipping into and out of rooms without a sound. He wasn't the kitten she had raised anymore. He was something else, something darker. She started noticing things small, odd things that hadn't been there before. A shredded piece of fabric under the couch, half of a chewed-up shoe, and an empty bag of cat food that had somehow ended up outside. At first, Emily tried to brush it off. Cats did strange things. But the more she observed, the more she realized something wasn't right. Shadow wasn't just misbehaving, he was changing. One day, Emily came home to find the back door slightly ajar, a faint draft coming in from the backyard. Shadow wasn't in the house, but the open door filled her with a sense of foreboding. She called out to him, but there was no answer. A knot tightened in her stomach as she stepped outside into the chilly afternoon air, calling for him. The backyard, which used to be her sanctuary, now felt like a dark and unfamiliar place. The tall oak tree in the corner loomed like a giant, its gnarled branches casting long shadows across the lawn. Emily walked toward the shed at the back of the yard, where Shadow sometimes liked to hide. But as she reached for the door, she froze. There, in the grass beside the shed, was something small, something bloody. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she bent down to inspect it. It was a small, torn piece of fur, a patch of white, matted with blood. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her mind racing. What had happened? She had never seen this before. What had Shadow done? She turned and hurried back to the house, calling for him again. Her voice wavered with fear. "Shadow, where are you?" But there was no answer. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. Shadow had been hunting. He wasn't the sweet, innocent kitten she had raised. He was something else, something primal, something dark. She had ignored the signs for too long, thinking they were just strange behaviors, quirks of a growing cat. But now, standing in her backyard, staring at the bloodied fur, Emily knew the truth. Shadow wasn't just a pet anymore. He was a predator. She didn't know what to do. She felt a mix of fear and disbelief, unable to reconcile the image of the innocent kitten she had once known with the creature standing before her now. What had happened to him? What had changed? That night, Emily locked all the doors and windows, her nerves stretched thin. She tried to sleep, but every noise, the creak of the floorboards, the faint scratching sound coming from the hallway made her jump. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Shadow, his cold eyes watching her from the darkness. She tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that it was just a phase, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Then, as she lay awake, listening to the eerie silence of the house, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the hallway. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She held her breath, her body tense with anticipation. Slowly, she crept out of bed, tiptoeing down the hallway. As she turned the corner, she saw him. Shadow was standing at the end of the hall, his back arched, his tail flicking like a whip. His eyes glowed in the dim light, and he didn't move as she approached. He simply watched her, as if waiting. She took a step closer, her heart racing. "Shadow," she whispered, but he didn't respond. His eyes never left hers. And then, in a blur of movement, he lunged at her, claws outstretched. She screamed and stumbled back, but before she could react, Shadow was gone, slipping back into the shadows like a phantom. The next morning, Emily packed her things and left. Shadow had shown his true nature, and she couldn't stay any longer. The love she once felt for him had turned into a cold, unshakable fear. She never returned to that house, never looked back at the creature she had raised. Shadow, the once innocent kitten, had become something far more dangerous. And Emily knew, deep down, that she would never forget the feeling of being watched by something that was no longer just a pet, but a predator.